Okay, AP Environmental. Hopefully everybody's doing good today. Today we're going to continue with Unit 5, and we're going to jump into a topic which I think is a really important one because it involves a lot of potential environmental damage. It's on pesticide use. It's topics 5.6 and 5.14. So again, I want to kind of revisit the green revolution. We've been talking about this for a couple of days now. And again, the green revolution is this idea that if we're going to feed the world, we're going to feed 7.8 billion people, then we're going to have to do it using some pretty revolutionary farm methods. These are things that again 150 years ago, like, we didn't do very much of these, but again, in order to grow a lot of food, we have to. We've talked about mechanization of farming. We've talked about monocropping and sort of the importance of that. In yesterday's lecture, I talked about GMOs, genetically modified organisms. Today, we're going to talk about the use of pesticides. Now, pesticides is kind of a general term because there's a lot of pests, lots of things that could potentially damage or ruin crops for farmers. So basically, a pesticide is any substance, it says natural or synthetic, that can kill or control organisms that people consider pests. And that can be anything from, insect pests to rodents like, mice and things like that, or birds, anything that could, again, potentially ruin some type of a agricultural crop. In the U.S., we are definitely the world's leader in pesticide use. 1/3 of the world's pesticide use is pretty much used up in the United States of America. We do a lot of farming, a lot of agricultural practices, and we use a lot of pesticides. So I want to just kind of go through just some general terminology here, some different types of pesticides. Insecticides, these are kind of exactly what they say they are. These are things that target insect species. Insects are probably the most common type of pests, so we use an insecticide to help kill those. Herbicides are more used for plant pests, weeds. Weeds can be weeds end up competing with the food crop, corn or soybeans or whatever it is, and again, that's not good for the crop yield for the farmer. So herbicides definitely help to kill off plant pests or weeds. Fungicides, these target fungus species. There are funguses that will affect plants as well. Broad spectrum pesticides. These are chemicals that basically kill a wide range of pests. They have, like, for example, broad spectrum herbicides or broad spectrum insecticides that will kill not just one particular pest, but they'll kill several. There are three pretty common ones that I'm going to talk about throughout the year. One of them is called glyphosate, one's called atrazine, and one's called DDT. And we'll talk about DDT a little bit today. And then we have what we call a selective pesticide. Selective pesticides are much more narrow ranged. They're typically used to kill specific types of pests. They're kind of the opposite of broad spectrum. All right, so some benefits of pesticides. Obviously, if you kill the pests, you'll have a higher crop yield, and that means more food. So, if we're trying to feed 7.8 billion people, pesticides, I suppose, are a beneficial way to do that. Increases profits for the farmer. So economically, that's a good thing for the farmer, and then eventually cheaper costs of food for the consumers. So, I mean, there's definitely some major benefits of using pesticide. Now, the negatives. One of the big negatives is pesticides can end up killing kind of a non-target species. Kind of like, remember back when we talked about overfishing. We said that all those techniques, even though they can help us catch a lot of fish, a lot of times they help us, or a lot of times they do damage to non-target species like sea turtles, sharks, and things like that. Well, same type of thing here. If we use these chemicals to kill, let's say, weeds, it could end up killing, other things that are not pests. So, one of these that I think is really important that we try not to kill is bees. Bees are natural pollinators, but a lot of times they're the insecticides that we use to kill other pests. Bees end up dying. They're kind of in the crosshairs on accident. They end up getting killed. So that's a problem. A lot of pesticides are driving what we call resistance. A lot of these pests are becoming resistant to the pesticide. I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes more about what that means, but that's becoming very problematic. We're having trouble developing new pesticides because a lot of these pests are becoming so resistant. Kind of an issue. And then finally, another big one, and this one really can affect humans, is water and air pollution. These chemicals get, let's say you spray them on a crop, but they end up getting, into the air. They end up traveling through air current. They end up getting into water supply. So that's kind of an issue. So here's kind of what I'm talking about when I talk about air and water pollution. Let's say, for example, you have some apple trees or something. You're an apple tree farmer, and you spray some pesticides on these trees. And again, that's intended to kill maybe a specific type of pest or maybe several pests. But what can happen to those chemicals? Yeah, they could land on the tree, land on the leaves, whatever. But a lot of those pesticides, especially if they're like aerosols, if they're kind of like like an airborne type of chemical, some of that stuff can just drift through the air, and it can travel somewhere else. So I mean, let's say you have like a neighborhood of people or something over here, that means those people might be breathing in those chemicals, and that could be an issue. Another problem is it could just run off along the surface, right? If that happens, it can run off into lakes and rivers and things like that. And not only could that cause problems for the wildlife that lives in those places, like fish and things like that, but if that's let's say a water supply for a town or something, that can be problematic. Um, it can obviously be taken into the ground. Um, this term here called sorption, that basically means that these chemicals can actually stick to the dirt. They can stick to clay particles, for example, and that means they can just kind of linger in the soil for a long period of time. Of course, they can be taken back up by the trees themselves. They can also leach through the soil and eventually get into groundwater. You know, most of the groundwater in this country is used either for irrigation purposes or it's used for drinking water. So we don't want a bunch of pesticide chemicals contaminating that groundwater. A couple terms over here. This term volatilization, that basically means that some of these chemicals, let's say that end up landing on the ground or landing on the leaves of plants, some of these things can just evaporate back up into the atmosphere. Um, Photo decomposition, that means that these chemicals can be broken down by sunlight. Sunlight can actually react with some of these chemicals and cause them to decompose into other chemicals that could end up being dangerous. We'll talk a lot about this a little bit later on in the year. We talk about air pollution, but that's a problem as well. So there's a lot of things here that can go on in the environment just by spraying these chemicals to kill a specific type of pest. So water pollution, air pollution, big deal when it comes to pesticide use. Pesticide resistance. Sorry, we had an intercom thing here. Anyway, I mentioned this earlier. When we are applying pesticides, typically we're doing this with a reason, right? We have a pest and we want to get rid of it. So let's kind of say here, if you kind of look at this diagram, let's say we have a crop that's infested with, I don't know, some type of pest. It could be a weed, it could be an insect, whatever it is. So what do? We develop a pesticide. And when we develop that chemical, we apply that chemical to those plants. So when we do that, most of the pests will probably die. If the chemical is strong enough, if we apply it to the entire crop and we don't miss any of the pests, most of them are going to end up dying. But like any organism, there's genetic variety. So some of these pests might be a little bit more resistant to this chemical than others will. So the ones that are more resistant, they're going to live and they're going to repopulate. And that means the next generation of those pests is going to be stronger. So what do we have to do, right? We have to apply another pesticide, maybe even develop a stronger pesticide, because now we've got a population of pests that's stronger than the previous one. So then the cycle starts all over again. You got to apply the new pesticide. Hopefully you kill them all, because if you don't, the strong ones are going to live and they're going to pop. So it's this constant cycle. And again, it's kind of a positive feedback loop, kind of like what we talked about earlier with the population size and agriculture. The problem with pesticide use is because the pests are becoming more resistant, it's becoming a lot more difficult to develop pesticides that are strong enough to kill these pests. So we're kind of losing the battle against the pests. So that's becoming very problematic. Another term here is called a persistent pesticide. Persistent pesticides are basically chemicals that stay in the environment for a really long time. Either they get into the soil, they get into water, they don't break down very easily, and they just kind of linger in our environment. A really good example of a persistent pesticide is one called DDT. DDT was a broad or is a broad range pesticide, which means it kills a lot of things. But it's also persistent, which means that it doesn't break down, it doesn't get out of the environment very easily. Now, back in the 1950s and 60s in the United States, this was a really common pesticide that was sprayed, all over the country because it killed a lot of pests. But the problem with it was that because it stays in the environment, it doesn't break down very easily. It ends up getting into food chains. It ends up, for example, let's say it gets into a lake or a pond or something, and it gets absorbed, by some of the microscopic organisms like zooplankton and phytoplankton, things like that. Well, then little fish eat those, right? And then that chemical gets into the little fish. And then bigger fish eat the little fish. So then the chemical gets into the bigger fish. And then maybe things like birds, for example, might eat, the bigger fish. So, DDT tends to accumulate into the tissues of these organisms as you go up the food chain. We call that bioaccumulation. Um, DDT was banned in the United States in 1972 because it did so much damage to specific food chains. One of the organisms that it did a really big amount of damage to was the American bald eagle. The American bald eagle back in the early 1970s was extremely close to extinction, and the reason is because this DDT chemical that was getting in the food chains, and the bald eagle is kind of at the top of the food chain. So much of this chemical would accumulate in the higher levels of the food chain that it really impacted the bald eagle. And what it did specifically was it affected their eggs. So when the eagle would lay an egg, for example, the chemical caused the eggs to be very brittle, and the eggs just would never hatch. So now you've got this species that lays eggs, to give birth to the babies, and the babies are all dying. So, I mean, this completely decimated the bald eagle population. So, but it was kind of a success because, I mean, it was banned. Like the government stepped in and said, "Hey, no more DDT use." And now today, the American bald eagle is off the endangered species list because they've made a rebound. They've come back, which has been a good thing. So, I mean, this is a good example, I think, of government intervention that could be a positive thing. I mean, we were using this chemical, all of a sudden the federal government says, no, 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 can't do this anymore. So they banned it, and now, the bald eagles is pretty well. And then we have a non-persistent pesticides. Non-persistent means that these chemicals will break down much quicker in the environment, so they can kind of be removed from the environment much faster. The problem with non-persistence is because they break down so quickly, they have to be reapplied constantly. A really good example of this is a chemical called Roundup. You've probably heard of this before. It's sold in hardware stores and Home Depot and those types of places. It's a pretty common weed killer and herbicide. The main component of Roundup is something called glyphosate. And again, this chemical breaks down fairly easily, but again, it has to be reapplied over and over and over again. So, I mean, it does end up staying in the environment just because of over application. So, make sure we know the difference between a persistent and a non persistent pesticide. This is what I was talking about earlier with, I called it bioaccumulation, but they also call it biomagnification. So, again, when these chemicals let's say they get into water, they end up moving their way up the food chain. That amount ends up becoming a lot more concentrated as you move up the food chain. So we get like these top end predators, for example. Per individual, there ends up being a lot more chemical in their bodies than, let's say, some organisms at the lower end of the food chain. So just make sure we know what bioaccumulation is or biomagnification. All right, last thing here today is something called integrated pest management. So, because pesticides are such a big problem environmentally, um, you know, farmers and scientists have decided to really push for a series of techniques that helps to kind of minimize the amount of pesticide use. And that's kind of an important thing because yeah, I mean, we're probably going to use pesticides, but we want to minimize their use as much as possible. One technique that we use as part of this integrated management system is something called intercropping. Intercropping is basically, or crop rotation, it's basically just the idea that we're going to kind of change our crops every season or maybe every year. Let's say rotate from, like, say, wheat to corn to soybeans. Now, even though that can be really expensive, what it does is if you rotate the crop, then you're eliminating the pest, because the pests that feed on wheat, for example, are different from the pests that feed on corn or that feed on soybeans. So if you're constantly rotating those crops, then you're kind of minimizing those pests. And that means you're probably not going to have to use as much pesticide. So crop rotation, intercropping, those are one way that we can kind of minimize the amount of pesticide use. Another one would be biological controls. Things like just as simple as like a dog or a cat, for example, that might be able to go out and kill a mouse or something that might be feeding on your carrots or something. I don't know. One of the most common forms of biological control is insect predators. Things like ladybugs, for example, or wasps. Using those organisms that aren't going to damage your crops, but they're going to feed on the predator, on those pests that feed on your crops. So biological controls is an interesting one that farmers use a lot. Physical controls, things like fences, traps, screens. Here's a picture of this, on the right-hand side here. And then finally, just, if you have to use pesticides, you do, but you just have to use them in very limited amounts. And again, that will kind of be a last resort. So again, I.P.M is just this series of techniques that we can use to help minimize pesticide use. That's the whole point. The thing about I.P.M is a lot of farmers need to be educated on how to use some of these techniques. And that's kind of a drawback because a lot of farmers are kind of set in their ways, and all of a sudden you want to teach a 70-year-old farmer, how to use I.P.M. That can be kind of problematic. So here's some of the benefits of it. Again, decreased chemical use. It's not going to probably eliminate all the chemical use, but at least it's going to decrease it. Again, economic savings for the farmer. In the long run, if he's going to have a higher crop yield, that's probably a good thing. Minimizes the loss of non-target species. So again, there's less non-target species that might get killed. It'll minimize air and water pollution because we're not using as much chemicals. It'll decrease pesticide resistance by pests because again, we're not using as much chemical. Higher crop yields. Now the negatives, it is time consuming. It does require a lot of manual labor. So that's something that maybe a farmer just doesn't have at his disposal. Maybe he doesn't have a lot of time to do this. Again, I mentioned this earlier. It does require education on for these farmers. A lot of farmers aren't willing to go through with the educational process, but maybe some of them are, so that'll be a good thing. And then finally, it's kind of expensive in some cases to start up this program. It's not cheap, but the thing is, even though it might be expensive to start it up, in the long run, it might end up saving the farmer money. So you kind of have to look at it as, what's the plan, economically. If the farmer's in it only for a very short amount of time, then maybe this might be a waste. But if he's in it for the long run, then IPM is probably the way to go. All right, but again, the results of IPM, these two graphs, I think kind of show this pretty well. This shows us, the number of pesticide applications. So, for example, before IPM training, before farmers are trained on these techniques, they're using a lot of pesticides. After they're trained, they're not using as much. So, I mean, that to me right there is the big benefit of IPM training. The other thing is crop yield. So you'll notice like before IPM training, where this bar is, but after IPM training, they have a higher crop yield. So to me, like the two biggest things are one, we're not using as many chemicals, and two, we're getting more food. So if we're trying to feed the world and we're not trying to damage the planet, I mean, IPM I think is super duper important. All right, guys, that's it for me for today. Thanks for staying with me there, and I will see you soon. Take care.